Here is, so here we're starting part 2 of the Cathedral and Racial Justice in Baltimore. We split it into 2 parts because it was too long as all of one, but then of course I discovered a bunch of new things. So I'm just gonna go through a whole bunch of stuff and and then we can, but I really wanna do it. I'm gonna keep track. I should take no longer than a half an hour for this and then 25 minutes or so, and then leave the rest of the time for discussion. And I'm hoping to wrap up. I figure it still makes sense to wrap up around 8 o'clock, really. So, so let me jump right in. Here's the same thank yous I had from last time, although I added a couple. I got in touch with Dr. Lawrence Brown, who spoke at a diocesan reparations discussion last fall that I wasn't able to make, but Bob Eloff told me about it, and he shared some information, some of which I put in here, some of which doesn't fit, but and then Father Gray Maggiano from the Memorial Episcopal Church is excited that we're doing this, and he also supplied some information. So let me, so just to recap, this is sort of similar to last time, but why we're doing this, the Cathedral expressed interest in grappling with racism at the annual meeting earlier this year. I'm sure many of you have been seeing a lot of the 5 years later pieces in the Sun and on the news. Yesterday was the 5-year anniversary of Freddie Gray's funeral and the rioting that evening. And so, you know, that's certainly on people's minds now. Plus the disparities are still with us in the middle of this coronavirus crisis. And also the diocese is considering reparations measures. The convention was supposed to be in May. It's been put off until the fall because of the coronavirus, but the diocese is preparing a resolution on reparations that, you know, perhaps these discussions can kind of fit in with as well. And then here is a map that I showed as part of part 1 of kind of Old West Baltimore. And I didn't realize last time, I'm going to try to gesture with my cursor here. You know, last time I really emphasized St. Barnabas, which was right here, and St. George's, which was right on Division Street. These are the nucleus congregations of the cathedral. We always, you know, we kind of knew that they had combined to form the cathedral, but Mary Klein just dug up this letter from Bishop Perret to the Diocese Standing Committee, really sort of sharing that the reason these churches wanted to move was because this was turning from white West Baltimore in the late 19th century to, you know, African Americans were gaining access to this part of the city. This would become the center really of segregated Black West Baltimore, with Pennsylvania Avenue being the cultural heart of that area. And this was the period when African Americans were first gaining access to this part of the city. But what I've learned since last time is that this was really quite a center of white Episcopal Baltimore, actually. Not only was St. Barnabas Church and St. George's Church here and Memorial Church, which I knew last time as well, but the bishop's house was right here on Madison Avenue. When Bishop Perret wrote this letter to the Standing Committee, he was living in this house right here, right very close to St. Barnabas Church. So when the cathedral was built in Guilford, both St. Barnabas Church and St. George's Church had a new place to worship, but also the bishop had a new house to live in. So the bishop and these 2 congregations left this part of West Baltimore. That left, now this is Lafayette Square right here. So this is where St. James Lafayette Square is right now. At this time, it was still the Church of the Ascension, the white Episcopal Church, which built this church back in 1867. Not only that, but St. Bartholomew's, I just learned, I'm not sure this is the exact church, but St. Bartholomew's was located right at the corner of North Avenue and Madison Avenue at that time. So a lot of these congregations were right in this part of the city. And not only do we have this language from one of our cathedral nucleus parishes, but Mary Klein has also discovered from the Church of the Ascension, which was at Lafayette Square. This is from the parish newsletter in 1927. Talking about how we have our backs to the wall at Ascension. We were facing tremendous odds, and there are all kinds of things in the 1920s, I'm not even including many of them here, that talk about the Negro invasion. It's amazing how bold-faced they were about it as something they wanted to be protected from. St. Bartholomew was joined with 5 other churches, Babcock Presbyterian and 3 other churches. It was an amazing example of interfaith cooperation, wrote to the mayor asking for protection from the Negro invasion of the 1920s. And so Church of the Ascension, though by 1932 had sold their church to the diocese, which then bought it for the use of St. James Lafayette Square, which is still there right now, and where our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, was rector from 1988 to 2000, and held their first service there on Easter in 1932. So, so this, so this is still, a center of Episcopal activity, but it's gone from white Episcopal congregation activity to African-American Episcopal activity. And this is the redlining map, the 1937 redlining map that I shared last time as well. This was drawn by the Roosevelt administration, did this for 200 cities around the country during the Depression as an effort to recommend to banks what were good investments for mortgages and what were bad investments. And what they meant for good investments were brand new, racially restricted white areas like the brand new Guilford and Homeland, Roland Park Company communities in Northwood, and 10 Hills. And when you look at the history of our congregations, our nucleus congregations, St. Barnabas and St. George's, moved from these areas that would be redlined to this white restricted area in Guilford, and St. Bartholomew's moved from this kind of yellow lined area on North Avenue to 10 Hills. And this map really formed, this is sort of a theme that I'm trying to kind of describe through these presentations of, wealth building, both as a matter of US public policy, but then kind of carried out through our institutions as well, where, this was literally federal public policy saying, you should issue 30, the federal government created the 30-year mortgage coming out of the Depression. That's a federally subsidized product. And those were only available generally for white people. I think 2% of them went to African Americans, 2% of FHA loans during this period went to African Americans. Mostly those for white people living in white communities. And it really it infused the whole building of the suburbs. Generally, if you wanted a federally guaranteed construction loan to build a suburban community, it had to be restricted to white people. And then, of course, the only people who could get FHA loans to live there were white people as well. People in these redlined areas, African Americans in these redlined areas, were really at the, needed to rent, generally speaking, rent from a white property owner at high rates. I mean, the segregation meant that where African Americans could live was very restricted. Supply was very restricted, and there was a lot of demand, and so white home owners white property owners could charge a lot of money for substandard housing. Yet another way that white people made money at the expense of African Americans during this period. And here's a little bit of a close-up of where St. Barnabas and St. George's, our predecessor congregations, moved from to where the cathedral is now. These areas, not only did African Americans need to rent generally from white property owners, but 1937 was also the passage of the US Housing Act, which created public housing in this country. Which public housing, as much as it was to give people decent housing, it was also an effort to get the white construction industry going during the Great Depression. And so the other thing that these redlined areas got was public housing. So this is the area where Gilmore Homes was built, where Freddie Gray was arrested 5 years ago. The St. Barnabas was right near where Murphy Homes, high-rise public housing, was built and then demolished. It's where Heritage Crossing is right now, which is a Hope 6 development. And then the Bishop's House was demolished. Mary Klein told me on Monday the Bishop's House was demolished in 1939, and that, of course, was to build McCullough Homes, which sits on the site where the Bishop's House was back then. So, and really all, most of Baltimore City's public housing was built in these sort of redlined areas, segregated African-American public housing. There was public housing for both. Actually, it was Congress required that it be segregated. Originally, there was public housing for white people as well. But these home ownership incentives coming out of the Great Depression in the New Deal were so strong for white people that many white public housing residents were able to move straight from public housing into wealth building home ownership, often in the suburbs. So now I'd like to jump to sort of widening the lens a little bit to the broader kind of regional demographics and disparities. The first graph is, this is where, in the middle of a census. This is census data going all the way back to 1790 for Baltimore City. This is just the city. And everyone, people generally know that the city's population peaked in 1950, and sadly it's declined ever since then. People mostly pay attention to this top line right here, but if you break it down racially, I think you get a better sense of the dynamic here. So this is the white population in Baltimore, and this is the African-American population in Baltimore. And you can see that in the 50s, you really began this dive in white population in Baltimore. This is the decade of Brown versus Board of Education, when Baltimore's segregated schools, the segregation rule was lifted. And this was also the area, kind of the height of the era of the GI Bill and federal subsidies for white home ownership in the suburbs. So really, by 1970, you really have a third of the white population of Baltimore. Baltimore loses a third of its white population. By 1980, in just 30 years, more than half of Baltimore's white population had left. And this is at a point when the African-American population was still increasing. And in fact, Baltimore became a majority Black city. And then these are some maps from, this is a study that I've helped coordinate at the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, HUD required fair housing analysis. But here you see in 1980, so this is sort of after Baltimore City has lost more than half of its white population, mainly to the suburbs. You can see just how contained the region's African-American population is within Baltimore City. And then over the next 3 decades to 2010, you see the African-American population really kind of gain access to Northwest Baltimore County. But we don't see, even 2010, this is not that long ago, we're not really an integrated region. We're still a pretty segregated region. And in fact, it's sort of remarkable, these areas of Northwest Baltimore County that were less than 25% African-American in 1980 that are now more than 75% African-American. And you can see these areas in Baltimore City, just how segregated Baltimore City remains essentially to this day. And then this is the most recent census data. Let's see if I can, you can see that African-American population very segregated. The top 2 quintiles are 80 to 90% and 90 to 100% African-American. It's just so how segregated we are in Baltimore. The only racial group that rivals that in this region are non-Hispanic white population. So this is, you see the top 2 quintiles are 60 to 80 and 80 to 100%. And you see where white population is concentrated, mainly in the rural outlying areas. But if you look at the Baltimore City inset here, Locust Point, where my office is, more than 80% white, Canton, and parts of North Baltimore as well. Another thing that we need to do in this fair housing analysis is look at racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. These are the dark orange census tracts in Baltimore City, including the 2 census tracts where our predecessor congregations came from. Those are racially concentrated areas of poverty. They have more than 38.5% poverty, more than half people of color. And I did the numbers in this analysis. More than half of the public housing in the entire metropolitan area is located in these dark orange census tracts in Baltimore City. And then you can see this is educational attainment. You can see just how closely it mirrors the racial map of Baltimore, with purple, number 1 being the lowest performing schools, the yellow being the highest performing schools. And the next slide shows that in just sort of the numbers. This is a HUD index for this analysis that we just completed. So you can see the blue bar is non-Hispanic white student performance. The green bar is non-Hispanic Black student performance. You can see there's a disparity in each jurisdiction in the region racially. And then, but because the city's performance is so different, so much lower, and the demographic disparities in the region, when you get to the whole region, that's when you really see the chasm in white student achievement and African-American student achievement. And this is, these things are still with us. This is actually from a very interesting Baltimore Sun series in 2017 called Bridging the Divide, written by Erica Green and Liz Bowie. These are graphs from that series that show that, these are national graphs. When we were aggressively integrating the schools from the 70s through the 80s, when we were doing busing and aggressive districting of the schools to integrate the student body, we were closing the racial achievement gap. It did not hurt white students. and yet African-American student achievement really rose. We were closing the gap both in reading and in math, and then we basically gave up on that. We haven't tried busing in a long time. Generally speaking, don't try aggressive redistricting to integrate our schools, and we really stalled on progress and closing the racial achievement gap. And these controversies are still with us. The Bridging the Divide series in the Sun was, it kind of profiled a Baltimore County redistricting controversy in 2015 and 2016. And then anybody who was seeing the news around Howard County last year, Howard County tried to redistrict their schools. They had to redistrict their schools because they had all this excess capacity in the Western County. And so the superintendent said, well, we should really, he was really looking to integrate them economically in terms of students in poverty, but it would have also resulted in some racial integration. And boy, look at these, this is the choose civility in Howard County jurisdiction in the Baltimore metropolitan area, but there are all these protests. Parents in Western Howard County did not want to integrate this, did not support the redistricting proposal. And then now we have the Kerwin Commission, which actually doesn't tackle school integration really at all. It really just looks at equitable resources. An uncharitable reading of it could be that it's trying to make separate but equal work just by redistributing resources. And even that is controversial. Our own governor last year was raising money to fight the plan, but the bill passed anyway this session. It's literally sitting on his desk right now. And then just moving, I just want to spend a little bit of time on housing wealth again. Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece in the Atlantic in 2014 called The Case for Reparations profiles Clyde Ross. And this shows just how recent this is. I mean, this is 1961, these redlined areas where people couldn't get conventional mortgages. A lot of times they had to, African-American would-be home buyers had to buy on contract. And so Clyde Ross, when he bought his house, he had to make a down payment. He made payments to the seller, not to a bank. He was responsible for all the maintenance, just like a homeowner, but he was building no equity. It was not a conventional mortgage, so he was building no equity until he made his last payment to the seller. And so at any time, if he missed payments to the seller, he could lose the entire house. And all the investments, all the repairs, all the down payment, all the investments he put in that house, he would just lose it just like a renter. And there was actually a Jesuit priest who worked with the Contract Buyers League with Clyde Ross in the 1960s, who went back and looked at the records and checked, like, what were these prices that these African-American home buyers were charged, looked at them, comparing them with the prevailing market rate for people who were able to get conventional mortgage loans. And these African-American home buyers were overcharged $3.2 to $4 billion. That's just in Chicago. Wealth going from African-Americans to, generally speaking, white sellers. Wealth that they could then not put into their house in maintenance, which then hurt the maintenance of these houses in these communities. And this, turning back to Baltimore, this is
the money is being sniffed up.
This is the foreclosure map of Baltimore. I'm almost to the end here. I'm wrapping up. This is the foreclosure map. So you can see, and the subprime map is exactly the same. Subprime loans were targeted to African-American home buyers. In fact, the Baltimore City sued Wells Fargo Bank, which settled, paid Baltimore City $7.5 million to settle that Fair Housing Act discrimination lawsuit. The last foreclosure crisis, since African-Americans have so much of their wealth in general in their houses, the foreclosure crisis literally wiped out half of African-American wealth in this country. Again, banks, generally white-owned banks, earning money at the expense of African-Americans. And so you see these disparities in home ownership. This is, again, a HUD. These are HUD figures from this fair housing analysis we did. In this case, the blue bar is African-American households, and this is white non-Hispanic households, the gray bar. So you can see in each jurisdiction, there's a pretty wide disparity in home ownership still, with us to this day, based on these historic policies. And then this is a really interesting story that you can still watch. Jane Miller from just February on Channel 11. She looked at two developments by the same developer, Keelty Incorporated, one in Edmondson Village, one in Rogers Forge, same house. But Edmondson Village has since changed from a white neighborhood to a black neighborhood. Rogers Forge is still predominantly a white neighborhood. And you can just see the value, the difference. Even when African Americans are able to access homeownership, it is not generally not the same wealth building tool as it has been for white people. And this is somewhat of the one of the tragedies of the Fair Housing Act is that you had all this wealth building activity in the post-World War II period. Then in 1968, finally Congress passes the Fair Housing Act to prohibit discrimination. But by that time, a lot of this wealth building had already been achieved. Edmondson Village was already a black neighborhood by 1968. Rogers Forge, you can see, had already become pretty expensive. I mean, not this expensive, obviously, but more expensive by 1968. So you say, oh no, now there's no discrimination, but a lot of these neighborhoods that have been subsidized by racially restricted homeownership, kind of wealth building incentives had become out of reach. This is a map. This is an interesting website. In fact, I think let me see if I can. I guess I'm sharing the. Let's see, I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to try to share the opportunity atlas here because I've got. So here's our here's this. If you go to Opportunity Atlas, you can go to any part of the nation. This is a Harvard economist named Raj Chetty, who got, this is big data in action. He got tax records and he put together census data and tax records for 20 million people born between 1978 and 1983. And through the tax records and the census data, he was able to kind of track them as they grew up and became adults. And so this is a map based on where you grow up, how much these people were born in this 5-year period from 1978 to 1983, how much they earn as adults. And you can zoom in, you can look at any census tract you want. And so you can go, for example, to our old church census tract in Sandtown, Winchester, where a child born in Sandtown, Winchester, grew up in Sandtown, Winchester in the 1980s, makes $18,000 on average. A child born in Druid Heights, where St. George's Church was and where St. Catherine's Church still is, born in that period makes $18,000 on average. Whereas a child born in our census tract of the Cathedral makes $61,000. So these places that have been constructed by these policies, all these different policies and all these different actions, homeowners, churches, where to locate, things like that. They create these places, and this is sort of the legacy of segregation that we sort of started in part 1 with the creation of slavery and really the creation of race in the 17th century here in Maryland and many other American colonies. And these are some of the consequences that are still with us today from that and all these different public policy and decisions that have come since then. So that, let me get back to the, I think I have one more slide. From the PowerPoint. Which is just sort of where do we go from here? Sort of next steps here. And so and this is where we can sort of discuss from here. We could have further discussions through adult formation. We could do smaller groups. What are reactions to this? How does it make you feel? What about the cathedral's work in Sandtown in the 1990s and 2000s? I was talking to Steve Fowle. He was saying he was active in that work in Sandtown. They just had no idea that this was literally the roots of our congregation were in that neighborhood. We could do reading and discussion there's all kinds of reading material that we could do. Betsy Stocksdale has been expressed some interest in the last session in leading that moving forward. We could learn more about Build's work. I've kind of shared with other people involved with Build that this is one of the reasons that I personally am so committed with Build, because it's really an institution in Baltimore that works across these lines of race and class to push for justice in Baltimore. And there's a great campaign for community health workers that our own Dr. Richard Bruno has worked with community health workers in Baltimore. And so we could learn about how that's really helping people right now. We could do outreach to St. Catherine's, which occupies the old St. George's building. We could connect with Memorial Episcopal. It's doing a similar grappling. We could create a task force to guide our work on this kind of thing. There's all kinds of things we could do. That's just a few ideas. And now I can stop talking. I think and we can circulate these slides afterwards. There's a bunch of things, people can read. There's all kinds of really interesting books out there about on this topic, and including a forthcoming book by Wes Moore and Erica Green about Baltimore's experience with Freddie Gray, and then Dr. Lawrence Brown is coming out with a book called The Black Butterfly. He kind of popularized this term of the white L and the black butterfly, and so he's got a book coming out in about a year. So, but why don't I unshare my screen now, and we can start an open-ended discussion about people's thoughts. I know there's a lot of information at once. So Rovan, how do you pronounce your name? Is it
It's Rovan.
Rovan, okay.
Yeah. One of the things I'm sure you are aware of, Dan, I don't know how many other people are aware, but it's recently come to my attention studying the history of Baltimore, the racial history of Baltimore, is the influence of the Great Fire of 1904, which burned out 70 blocks of downtown Baltimore, and the city took it as an opportunity to do a number of very progressive things, like install the first sewer system and widen Lombard Street and Pratt Street. That's why they're such big streets now. But one of the things that was thought to be very progressive was to get rid of the African American communities downtown that were intruding on white space. And the area, for instance, in front of Mercy Hospital that we know of as Preston Gardens was once a thriving African American community with 3 large churches, one of which was Bethel. And they were all shoved out, forced to move into West Baltimore, starting immediately after the fire in 1904. And that's where a lot of this surge of African Americans into West Baltimore that you're tracing the ripples of in the churches that we have here, where that came from. And that's just a dynamic in the city that I had never before been aware of. But the Great Fire and the consequences of it racially were very profound. And you're giving the details in terms of the Episcopal Church's experience of that as people moved into West Baltimore, but they were forced to by city policy after that.
Mark, did you want to jump in? Mark Baumster, you're muted, Mark.
Unmute yourself.
Mark, you need to unmute.
I didn't. I'm sorry. I didn't have a. I thought you were. You had me muted, but that's okay. I don't have a specific observation. I didn't have one. I think it's just. I'm, as far as steps going forward, I'd be fascinated in being involved in some of the additional readings. I mean, I think that's something that's personally for personal learning. I think that would be very useful. A point that I had suggested in one of the earlier discussions, I was just very interested in. We are a relatively small congregation. I think there is probably a critical mass of people who are interested in connecting to broader activity in some fashion, and I'm just very interested in how other institutions in the city and in the community can network with each other to kind of I guess accelerate our clout on these things. Because I think when realistically we're talking about generations worth of inequity that has been built through all of these different factors that you outlined, and it's not within the practical ability of any one institution to remedy that by itself. So it's just a matter of how can we add our chips to the pile for what it is that we can do to kind of multiply the effect going down the road. Just how can we network? Because realistically, you take a look at any of these things, and And you can kind of despair of saying, oh, geez, what can I possibly do? Or what can we even collectively as a whole group possibly do to make a dent in this? And any one institution can't, but there's many of us around who are feeling the same thing. So how do we knit up with those folks?
Yep, and Memorial is doing the same. I think they're going through the same process really right now. So that would be one church we could link up with. Anyone else want to jump in?
Don?
Hello. Turn your sound down, Sarah.
Oh, I see. If you're sort of in the same room, that might be, you might get feedback. Yeah.
Dan, you mentioned partnering with St. Catherine's of Alexandria, but has anybody thought of partnering with St. Luke's Franklin Square, which is doing amazing things in that area, but it is desperate financial straits?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with St. Luke's. I think there are people at the cathedral who have attended there even.
Yes, there are.
Yes.
And they are doing wonderful things there. Yeah.
The congregation, though, is down to, I mean, the actual congregation is down to about 12 to 13 people. The wonderful things that they're doing are basically things that started with Van Gardner and with his daughter particularly, who is a school teacher, and the after school program, which of course now is non-existent because there is no school to be after, has really been a wonderful program. And but quite honestly, the future of St. Luke's as a parish is really in jeopardy at the present time. Whereas St. Catherine's is an active group of almost entirely African American members, an active congregation, and might be a very interesting connection. They were founded by as an Anglo-Catholic parish, as an alternative.
Mount Calvary.
Mount Calvary.
Yeah.
And no, of course, now Mount Calvary has become Roman Catholic. And interestingly enough, I did a visitation actually at both St. Luke's and at St. Mary the Virgin before the pandemic. And Mount Calvary makes ovations from time to time to St. Catherine's. So it would please me as the bishop of the diocese to have more connections being made with Episcopal churches. I mean, they're not in danger of becoming Roman Catholic, but they had a long historical tie. It was a rather sad historical tie because it was exactly because Mount Calvary did not want Black people worshiping at Mount Calvary. And so they built St. Catherine's at quite a distance away from themselves, and began to do services there. And then for quite many years now, St. Catherine's has had its own clergy. But it's a very interesting church, and it's in a very interesting neighborhood. St. Luke's is also, I mean, there's lots of needs for the ongoing after school program for people from the cathedral to get involved in.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in there and say that since, and I'm Rob Bolter, I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and we've been engaging in this conversation for a couple of years now about developing some criteria for our justice and outreach activities. And the St. Luke's Youth Center, sometimes called SLIC, is sometimes the acronym that they use. We have a lot of crossover between people who are at the cathedral who are interested in the possibility of us supporting that program. And I think, Jim, if that's what you were going to talk about, is that they've actually approached us. Go ahead, you say more.
Well, so just to add into what Rob's saying, so SLIC is, and that after school program is one of the programs that's currently on our list to look at and evaluate whether that's one that we want to support as a cathedral. So it's definitely on our radar for sure.
I also would like to point out I'm a member of Holy Nativity in Lower Park Heights, and we've had a very robust ministry there. We are the only storefront Episcopal church probably in the United States. And in terms of our history, we had a big, huge building with a tower and stained glass windows and so on up near the intersection of Liberty Heights and Garrison. And shortly after I was there as a teenager, the congregation made a racial change, but it became one of the few stably integrated churches, not only in the Episcopal Church, but anywhere. When you talk about integrated churches, you're usually talking about a church in transition. But Holy Nativity has remained genuinely white and black, and we have a significant Caribbean population and so on. And we have people with PhDs and homeless people, and it's Mother Vicky, who was there, always called it a vision of the kingdom of God, because it really represented everybody, and it's stayed stably that way. And we've had a robust ministry up there, but we built a $3.5 million children's center for the neighborhood in conjunction with the Lutheran Church, but that has gone off on its own, and now we are kind of dying on the vine, except that there's a program next door to us called Sister Saving the City that works with young people in the neighborhood, and does some very interesting things with the teenagers in the neighborhood. But the Bishop Sutton has talked about linking us with St. Catherine's in terms of a common clergy. So I don't know, we don't know what's going to be in that future, but I just want to raise my hand as representing one of the congregations in an African-American community in Baltimore that is in need of some assistance and linking with other people's help. So.
Great. Anyone else? Mary? Mary and then Jean? You need to unmute, Mary. I think you're still muted.
Okay.
You're still
go ahead,
muted,
Jean.
Mary.
Now I'm okay.
There you go. Now we
Okay.
can hear you.
Thank you. I think there are two directions here, and both are worthy. One is basically to meet other people who come from different backgrounds than we do, for the most part. And so a link with the church that's primarily African American, so we can meet people as individuals and understand their issues and problems, both as Christians, church members, and just neighborhood people. So that's outward facing. But I also think the information that you presented is so indicting of white people. And it's hard to get your mind around to understand what your responsibility is in the face of that overwhelming structure that benefited us. So I think the white folks need to talk to each other about the Kool-Aid they drank when they were kids. What made them think this was okay? What made them think that this was the norm? And how do we understand the benefits that came to us? So I'd like some internal discussion and some external connections as our next step.
Yeah, I think Ed has kind of brought to our attention, and Steve Fowle, I think that the New York Diocese is doing. What are the three things, Ed, there? It's like the year of, I can't remember the
It's
three, but
a year of lamentation, a year of apology, and a year of reparation. So that would be the three phases. And the thing that, Mary, along the lines of what you were saying, I do think that this is a process, and we do have to, think about reaching out, but there is internal work.
Yes.
Although I would maybe adjust what you were saying a bit and say, we don't just have to talk as white people. We're in a community with all kinds of races, and we just need to talk about it. I really think it's a very powerful step to take, and it's one that I'd like to explore with my faith community.
Chris.
Jean, did you have, Jean, you were gonna, I think you had your hand up, right, to say something?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to say that the webinar yesterday from the Brookings Institution was really gripping.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if anybody hasn't seen it, that you can still go and watch it. and I've ordered both of the books, both the book about reparations for African Americans and the whole history that justifies that, and the stages that we have to go through of really coming to grips with what's happened, and then figuring out how to mourn and how to make redress and reparations. It's a long process. And the woman who is the specialist on the history of Germany and reparations after World War II, how Germany addressed this, she was very good, and I'm going to enjoy reading her book too. So I think that we have a lot of study to do, and I really recommend that webinar and the books in terms of framing for us what we have to do, the enormity of the task.
I'll find the link to it.
In the
On the Brookings Institute.
Yeah, there was a link to it in.
Dan can send it out again.
Yeah.
Chris,
Yeah, in one of your emails last week, you sent it out. So I think we need a lot of study and a lot of internal discussion and a lot of outer action. It's just an enormous task. It's, you know, our nation has so much work to do to come to grips with where, you know, how we built this country. Abner's ready to chime in.
I'd just like to say that one of the ways we integrated, totally integrated Church of the Savior in Washington in the 60s and early 70s until today, it is totally integrated, is because the leader of that, Gordon Cosby, said we cannot get integrated unless we have a friend in the Black community. So each member of the church who are white had to find a friend, family in the Black community. Get to know them as friends. If you don't have that, you will never know their problem. Then you can never integrate. And that is one of the keys, in my opinion. If I can say that at 88 to you, this is the only way you can integrate any church, any denomination, anywhere. You have to be friends with the Black and know their problems. When you become friends, you know the problem, and you will never think that these are problems. I hope I'm communicating what I'm saying.
Chris has had her hand up for a little bit. Let's make sure we hear from her.
Well, I don't need to because Dr. Abner said everything I needed to hear. Today. It's really important. One, this is not about guilt. This is about recognizing the history of our country. And before we can really do anything in the country, we have to do something with our church. And I just want to just suggest very strongly that you continue to do the work together as a group. And as you are, quote unquote, considering which parish to reach out to, that you have to know them. That you can't go in as the we're here now sort of thing, that there's some real intentional work that has to be done, even in starting a conversation with a predominantly Black church, out of respect, out of the deep-seated suspicion sometimes, and out of who we are, and I'm going to say who we are as the Episcopal Church, that we have to recognize. We've been down this road many, many times, and many, many discussions have started and faltered, and mostly faltered and started. So in order to go out, you have to go in first. And so I commend that you continue to have these conversations and understand what it is that you're really trying to affect and do.
Betsy?
Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Who was it who outlined 3 phases? A year of lamentation, a year of...
That was Ed Stokes.
Okay. Ed, who was it who designed the 3 phases in the succession, and how can I find out more about that?
Well, I can't actually answer the question. I went to the New York Diocese website and found that, and that was first at Steve Fowles. He was the first one who mentioned it to me, and I went to the website and read up on that.
Chris, you had your hand up, but do you have some more information on that?
It is the Diocese of New York's Anti-Racism Committee. They have been involved in this work for many, many, many years. When I was in the Diocese of Newark, the Diocese of Newark and the Diocese of New York did some extensive work around reparations. They created a really fantastic anti-racism training, and through the years they've done a lot. And in the last year, they created this look of a year of lamentation, a year of reconciliation, so that it's on the New York, the Diocese of New York website.
And I would certainly hope, I would love it if this kind of developed into a way to strengthen our relationships, you know, within the cathedral, with other churches. I know I have, oh wait, am I? No, can folks hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I've really benefited from Build's training on one-to-one conversations and group conversations. And so I would love it if we use this as a way to kind of really work to strengthen, because one of the things that segregation does is it separates people. It keeps us from even knowing who people are. And it's not like we are gonna, you know, we have to go around, you know, like Chris said, it's not about guilt, it's not about self-flagellation, it's not about coming in as a white savior, trying, you know, kind of unintentionally coming off as kind of a white savior. It's just, I would love it if this could be the beginning of just working to strengthen relationships, and then figuring, you know, have that lead to what we're going to do. What then out of those relationships, I think we'll discover what kind of action we can take together, and what set of people can work together to take what action, so that we can not feel hopeless as individuals or even as just one church, but build the group of people. I mean, that's you know, what I've learned through Build too, is like, just the more people you have organized who understand what they care about, what their self-interest is in this, and can find things that we can all work on together, that can be really powerful. Jim?
Yeah, and just to add to what you just said, Dan, because I've noticed in a few of our comments, we've talked about getting to know other people and getting to know what their problems are and their difficulties. And while that is true, and obviously from the data that you showed us tonight, Dan, there are huge disparities. But I would just like us to also not think necessarily of problems, but also the assets that people in other communities have.
Amen.
Because there's so much that we can learn, there's so much that they bring. And I think what you're saying, Dan, is the more that you get to know someone, the more you get to know the whole of someone, and not just some of their struggles, but also the amazing goodness of them as well. So I would just like us to keep that in mind too, as we think about this whole process.
Yeah, a relationship goes two ways. It's not, you know.
Exactly, yeah. And to think of it more of you can think of something as a deficit-based approach, meaning what are the difficulties here, but you can also look at an asset-based approach. You know, what are the good things in the community that are already there that sometimes we miss because we're only looking for the difficulties. So I think we need to do both.
Amen. Amen.
Don, did you?
Don is one.
I think that one of the things that we have to be careful about.
There's a lot of feedback.
Sarah's got to mute herself.
Right.
One of the things that we should be careful about is that, as several people have said, getting to know the people is critical. And one of the things we should learn from was the 20-year experience of the cathedral working with Sandtown Habitat for Humanity. Steve Fowle would be a great resource for this because he was intimately involved. He got the cathedral involved in Sandtown in the first place. And during that period, many people in the cathedral spent many hours in Sandtown meeting and working with residents in Sandtown and learning their problems and developing empathy with with them.
Learning their joys.
And learning their joys too. They have, the folks in Sandtown have great love of God, great love of the church, and we need to recognize that as well as their problem.
Betsy? I think you're muted, Betsy. Were you trying to speak?
Okay. I was not a member of the cathedral until last year. And when I worked with Habitat, it was through a different church. I was also extremely impressed with the people in Sandtown. I just loved it there and met some absolutely wonderful people. So my question is, and I had already proposed this to Sarah, and not sure why we didn't go anywhere with it. It's probably my fault. I probably dropped the ball. But I would love to see us do that and wonder why the cathedral's connection to Sandtown ended. That's it.
So we're coming up on our time here. Sarah, did you want to?
So I will
I
say
think we could
that,
do a whole session on that perhaps, but
Yeah.
but there might be.
so I would say stay tuned. We hope to have an ongoing conversation in 2 weeks, and we'll be getting some information out to the congregation. Hopefully by this Friday's email, if not by next Tuesday's. The question about Sandtown, Betsy, is very complex, and you've got some of the players who are here tonight. We could take a look at what happened in the past, but one of the things we need to remember is that Sandtown Habitat no longer exists, and that Chesapeake Habitat, has been ongoing. But so it's a complex question that involves not just us, but some other institutional challenges that organization had. So as Dan said, I wish it is literally 8 o'clock. This is more time than we have on a Sunday morning, but we are planning an ongoing conversation in a couple weeks. So stay tuned. We are not done with this topic.
And Sarah, so 10 o'clock on May 10th? Is that?
That's what I'm hoping. Yes.
Okay. So stay tuned. We may continue this conversation.
Mother's Day. That's a Mother's Day, just so you know.
Really?
It is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
It's always that Sunday in May, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know just where I'll be.
No one is taking me out to lunch that day. I know.
Yes.
So I'll be here. Pretty sure.
What about Tuesday nights rather than?
Let us do that internally, and we'll figure out when the best.
Figure out a time, but yeah, I think it would be great. We can have a structured conversation. Zoom lets us split into small groups, so maybe we can do that to have a little more discussion, so it's not such a big group.
Dan, before you sign off, Dan,
Well, no, I wasn't going to sign off just yet. I just wanted to drop you. I did put the link to the Brookings Institution
in the chat.
video of the webinar in the chat. So if you want to capture that and click on it or put it in a browser right now, you can take a look at that.
I just wanted to, before you say some final words, Dan, just to say thank you to Dan for his presentations. I wasn't able to
Amen.
attend the first one, but I did get to watch it. It's really powerful. Part of what our internal work to do is to just own up to our own history. And this is helping us to do that. And so that's important work. And I thank you for your leadership on that, Dan. I want to thank also, Ed and Jim, who sit on the chapter. And we've been talking at the chapter for 2 years about being more intentional about how do we do the work that we need to do as a community, and what do we want to do in terms of what justice and outreach is for the cathedral. A lot of people identify that as an important part of the work that we're called to do, but we've been less than intentional about it in the last several years. And so we're getting back around to it, and we're trying to establish some processes and some ways to be in conversation, and also some ways to experiment and explore. So I just appreciate your leadership on this, Dan. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thanks, Rob, and everybody who's joined. This is, I feel like this is stuff that gets lost in the history books. I mean, there's probably a reason why it didn't get in the history books. And so the more familiar I get with this, mostly through my job, but also through my neighborhood, learning about my neighborhood, the more I want to share it. And I'm just really encouraged that there's this much interest in it. And I really hope that this can help strengthen our relationships within the cathedral and with our city. And that it can lead to something in the long term. So I'm really encouraged. I really appreciate everybody joining us, and I'm really excited to see where this goes.